Right, Amy, thank you so much for being here with me today. My name's Allison Strobel. I'm a board member with Digitunity, a national nonprofit organization whose mission is to ensure that everyone who needs a computer has access to one. And I'll say personally, from past experience in the public sector and in public administration, I always sort of intuited that personal computer ownership was really central to digital equity. There are certainly lots of things in my life that I know that I far prefer to do on my personal computer than on my smartphone, for example. I save lots of stuff until I can sit down at a computer and type away and see things on a large screen. So I was really excited to see your research and would love to have you just introduce yourself and your paper, and then I'll pepper you with questions.
Sure, sounds great. Yeah, my name is Amy Gonzales. I'm an associate professor at UC Santa Barbara in the Department of Communication. And my research has been interested in understanding digital equity broadly, but especially the role of devices. And my work in particular has focused on kind of intermittent disruptions in access to technology of all sorts, but often that means the devices themselves become slow or, you know, yes, someone has the computer, but it sits in the corner and no one turns it on because it has a virus and they can't figure out how to get it off, or phones are stolen or they break, etc. So there's lots of different ways that sometimes we all come in and out of access, but of course, when those disruptions occur, it's much more problematic for those of us that don't have the resources to fix things or borrow a new device, or the literacy to navigate Cox cable, etc. So this paper that we'll talk about today is very much in keeping with that broader line of work. And I've been working with Digitunity for many years off and on because of our shared interests. And I just so appreciate what this organization does and kind of who they are for us in the digital equity space nationwide. So thank you for having me.
So I think building on what you were just saying, what specific question were you trying to answer with this research, and what were your hypotheses going into the study?
Sure. So actually, going back to the research I just described, part of the reason I was so excited about this study, this data set, is because over many years, I have been in conversation with folks at NTIA who determine what types of questions are being asked on the census, specifically the supplement in the census data, the annual census that comes out, right? A subset of questions gets asked annually. And these include a series of questions related to what kind of internet access we have, what we do when we're online, etc. And so I've been advocating for a question about the quality of our computing. And because my work finds that sometimes even those people, as I mentioned, who have computers, if their computer doesn't work sufficiently, that might hamper their ability to really engage with the breadth of resources online. So students whose computers don't work as well, for example, in one study, their grades are lower. Even when we control for their, family income and other things that might be associated with that. So I finally got these same questions on the census, and I really wanted to play with them and figure out, how nationwide, now that we have this nationally representative data set, what will we find? And so the first step in that process, however, of course, is just to validate what we assumed we would find, because we know this from years and years of research that internet access, at-home internet access in particular, access to a computer, ownership of a computer, or at least regular use of a computer, which we assume means having one at home that you can use, and then having access to a smartphone should all generally be positively associated with some really important uses of the internet. In our particular case, we focused on employment, like job searches, a few different measures related to healthcare. Am I more likely to be looking at my e-health records, or am I having regular communication with my doctor, for example? And so the finding there not surprising was yes, all of those outcomes are um, we're more likely to be doing those things online. Sorry. My third my third outcome measure was also, am I using the internet to search for government services of any sort? So yes, having those three um, kind of core types of physical access to technology were all positively associated with or increased the likelihood that people were also using the internet for employment, government services, and e-health. But what we were really struck by was just how the effects of computers seem to be consistently across we looked at survey data across two sampling years. And so found that both in 2020 and in 2023, it seemed like having access to the computer mattered most. And so this then became something that we probed further, which led us to kind of the broader paper that we wrote up.
So what would you may have addressed this, but I want to ask the question precisely. What are one or two most important findings readers should take away regarding large screen personal computer ownership and why it matters?
Sure. Um, for me, I think that what we found is that consistently computer access seems to be the most important or most strongly associated with these beneficial uses of the internet, which is strange, right? A lot of us tend to think of internet access as the first step towards digital equity. And it is certainly important, but um, our data suggests that perhaps to some degree, because people are able to take their computers out of the home to find internet access elsewhere, whereas if you don't have a computer, internet access without a computer, is really, it only gets you so far, right? So having that device seemed to be the most important piece in order to use the internet for beneficial purposes. And we tested this a second way, which was we actually looked at homes just to further make sure our finding was robust. Homes that had computers but no internet, and we compared those to homes with internet and no computer. And so this second test of the same question also supports that finding that it's actually seems to be more beneficial if you have to only have one to have the computer, um, because those homes seem to be finding ways to get online more easily and use the internet for beneficial purposes, perhaps more easily than those homes that only have the internet but no computer. So computers matter. I would say the other kind of key piece is, interestingly, when you looked at homes with smartphones and no internet service, that was the one instance where actually sometimes we see a negative relationship between access and beneficial use. Internet homes with smartphones but no internet service are actually less likely, for example, to be getting online for e-health purposes. Um, and this could be due to lots of reasons that I could elaborate on if we wanted to. But what as a package this tells us is that what we really need is internet and devices together, right?
I think that is absolutely fascinating. And just before moving on, in layman's terms, can you
Yeah.
define what you mean by beneficial internet use and how
Yeah.
computer ownership helps people engage in these activities in their everyday lives?
Yeah. So you could look at that a lot of different ways. As I said, in our particular study, the ways that we tried to measure beneficial internet use, I can actually kind of go to the specific questions to make sure that I'm being really accurate. Um, was we asked people, or the census data asks, in the past 6 months, have you used the internet to search or apply for a job? So we think of that as beneficial if you're benefiting from the internet by using it for job searches. Um, we also asked, Are you using the internet to do things like register to vote or renew your driver's license, right? Those are daily tasks that we all have to do, or not daily, but regular tasks that we all have to do. And so the internet seems to be a resource for people to do those kinds of life work tasks. And then the third benefit of being online was, do you or anyone in your household use the internet to search for health information, access your health records, or let's see, the third one was communicate with your doctor. And so we averaged those three to say that benefit was kind of health related benefits. So those were our three kind of beneficial types of internet use that we were interested in.
And then what initially sparked your interest in comparing the benefits associated with these three fundamental first level digital resources, computers, smartphones, and in-home internet service?
Well, after years of working with Digitunity and just in my own work, I have often thought that computers are as the device, the kind of large screen device, as I tend to call it, because of course our smartphones are computers, right? But when I say computer, we typically mean a large screen computer, right? At least a laptop, if not a desktop. That they're often undervalued within the digital equity space, maybe taken for granted. Policies don't kind of invest in them in the same way that we have in kind of getting broadband. And I think there's a reason for that, right? Broadband infrastructure is so expensive that it seems more intuitive that we'd see a lot of government investment in that realm. But I think perhaps as a result, we've maybe sometimes overlooked the type of investment that's needed in making sure that people have regular access to computers, because in reality, they are also very expensive, right? My computer cost over $1,000. And many excellent computers do, and that's a lot of money for a lot of people. So partly it was just longstanding awareness that maybe we should pay attention to devices and think about them. And so no one had really looked at a comparison in this way, because we always assume that we need all three, phones, computers, and internet. And that is indeed true. But I was really curious if you had to just look at them individually, what would that look like? And I was really surprised to see just how important computers tended to be.
And what surprised you most in your findings? It sounds like it might have been, I mean, I'm fascinated by the idea that having just a smartphone seemed, that having just a smartphone seemed to be, not supportive of beneficial uses as you describe them and define them, and we're researching them. But further to that, that if you could only have one, that having a large screen computing device was more beneficial than just having in-home internet access.
Yeah. And I mean, yes, those were absolutely the two things that were most surprising. And when I going to the first, when we found this, we looked around at the research and we weren't the first people to find something like this. And I think there's possibly different reasons for that. One, as you described, sometimes it's just really hard to do a lot of things on our phones, because they're so small. And so it makes sense that maybe you're not, taking the time to log into your e-health records. What was interesting though was that kind of combination between having the phone, if you had the phone and you had internet at home, those households still tended to use the phone in beneficial ways. The phone didn't seem to be the most important piece, but it was still important. It was those households that had a phone and no internet service that perhaps something about those households, right? One thing I need to recall is that these data are not testing causal relationships, right? We didn't manipulate what kind of access people have so that we could say we know that it is only because of these things that this type of configuration of access, that therefore people will use the internet in X, Y, and Z way. We just know that there happens to be a relationship in households where people have smartphones and no internet access. It's those households where we see actually that they're less likely than to be using the phone in these benefits, or the internet rather, in these beneficial ways. But there is some research that suggests that not only are phones sometimes harder to manage for these complicated tasks, but also they're a distraction, right? They themselves can be really distracting, right? And so maybe what we know, what that data is telling us is that These are households that maybe don't want to or more likely can't afford to invest in digital resources broadly, right? Maybe they can't afford also to be spending the, 50 to $100, sometimes more a month on internet service. Maybe those same households also have a more difficult time investing in things like time to check in with their latest labs or regularly contact with their doctor, right? And so um, that was a pretty surprising finding at first, but perhaps the phones again become in those contexts more of a kind of tool just to get by, just to watch shows or text with your friends, when they're your everything device and not kind of that's harder to make sure that they're also um there's time or that they're associated with kind of the logistics of life that can often slip through the cracks, right? Like healthcare or renewing your driver's license. But yes, going back to your question, I would say the other finding was not that was surprising was not just that the internet, or excuse me, that computers were the most important at all, but that it was really consistent across these various different outcomes of employment and government services, et cetera, across multiple years of the survey. I think there was maybe only one instance when computers weren't kind of the most important. And again, when you isolate computers without internet and vice versa, and still see this effect. So it was really the robustness of this finding that just, again, really underscores that I think we're missing something in the conversation around computers as a really key element to ensure digital equity.
I think digging into that a little further, can you talk about how computer quality affects people's ability to use the internet in beneficial ways and why having a well-functioning computer matters?
Sure. I mean, as I mentioned, I've been working in this space for a while, and um, I had done surveys with kind of smaller subgroups, so student surveys or student surveys with just individuals with chronic illness. I've done a lot of qualitative work, qualitative interviews, in-depth interviews with low-income individuals, and so have a lot of other scholars. And we've all just seen again and again that because technology is, it breaks, it's fragile. It's that's not surprising to any of us. I remember during COVID, I was in the middle of writing up a report for my university within the first few months when the university shut down, and we were trying to think through kind of emergency technology resources once we knew students were going to have to all disperse to their homes. And my cat chewed through my power cord, and I lost, I knew then I only had the length of my computer battery at that moment. And I started to panic, and I realized just how ironic that was. But I didn't have to think twice about driving to Best Buy and paying $80 to buy a new power cord, right? But for a lot of people, dropping $80 like that, which, that was in the before times, so I'm sure it would be $150 today, is a lot of money, right? And so these disruptions in technology occur, but when they do, if you're a household where money is tight, you've got multiple kids, people are already sharing devices, you're sharing the bandwidth of those devices. Um, when things break, they're really hard to replace. So I refer to that as technology maintenance, the constant work that we have to do to stay connected to internet and computing. And to answer your question, across this body of work, when those problems arise and we can't fill the gaps, we have worse grades, we have greater stress. I've consistently found that people talk about lost employment. If their phones have periodically been turned off and they're working shift work, they miss out on shifts, or they're doing part-time work off the books and they're, can't get called for a roofing job or et cetera. Often people also talk about not just the kind of lack or the loss of physical resources when our devices break and when our computers in particular break, but also kind of the lost emotional support when we can't use our devices to get on social media and stay in touch with our friends and family and check our email or kind of use the social component of technology. People become more isolated. So there's kind of really practical implications of losing our uh, access, and there's also emotional implications. And I think the computers in particular are especially important for that first piece, that being able to kind of do life because that large screen is helpful. But in reality, I think both are really important, and sometimes we lose sight of just the also the value of the kind of social and also entertainment value of computers that we get from being able to also turn on a show and lower our stress level when the world is crumbling around us, things like that as well.
Thanks. And I think building on what you said a little bit, and you've given a few examples of this, but when it comes to using the internet for beneficial activities, and the difference between having smartphone access versus large screen computer, are there other benefits that you or that your research found in terms of relying exclusively on a smartphone for internet access or disadvantages to smartphone only use that you haven't touched upon?
Um, I, since this is going to get edited, I'll just say that my work hasn't looked at that. Apart from this paper, I haven't really looked at that too much. So I can tell you what the ways that I do know that computers are beneficial, but in reality, there's actually just not a lot of work that kind of compares. Now, having said that, certain people certainly have done that, and other scholars have found that um, uh, in addition to again, it's kind of these practical sides of things. So maybe um, sometimes being less likely to engage in civic participation or political life, things like that. We also know from a fair bit of again other scholarship that we don't get the same digital skills, and I think this is actually a huge reason to ensure that we have large screen access because it's having physical access that allows us to gain the literacy that we need to get by in the world today, right? To being able to kind of try and test out and play around with the computer is really important for what we're able to do next month and next year, so that when we do need to be able to, apply for that job or have a Zoom interview or talk to our doctor, we've had some practice with the screen. Um, so I think it's the types of tasks that we do often um, really help are broader and sometimes more in depth when we have a computer versus a phone, especially again in the realm of these kind of practical life tasks. But also we know that we don't get the same kind of skills from just being constrained to the phone.
You've got me thinking about so many things that I sort of take for granted that, like I'm not learning or deeply using Excel on a phone. I'm not practicing like file management skills to save, medical reports from a provider or something like that on my phone. Those are all things that are much more conducive to computer use.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, I mean, to that point, yeah, I mean, how often have we been fighting with some sort of activity on the phone and you get stuck and you think, I'm going to do this later in front of a large screen, right? I think those moments when we get stuck, that a lot of it, that's where we often get our skilling in, right? Is when we're faced with a problem and then we have to troubleshoot. And that's just often so much easier on a larger screen.
Yeah, I can't properly format my resume, even in LinkedIn on my phone, but I can
Right.
on a larger screen, and then it's there on my phone for future use. But
Yeah, absolutely.
so Research at Digitunity shows that 1 in 7 households lack a large screen computer, and your research obviously demonstrates how essential computer ownership is for beneficial internet use. What key message would you want leaders in education, healthcare, workforce development, government, and nonprofits to take away from your findings?
Yeah. Again, I just so respect the work that Digitunity does to kind of shine a light on these issues. Um, and I'm not saying anything that hasn't been said before, but I think we really need to think of internet and computers as a package. And I think that these data underscore that because in reality, people were most likely to be doing engaging in beneficial tasks when they have all of these resources at their fingertips. But I think we need to realize that having just one of those, right? Having just the internet or having just computers, it's like having one tire on a bike or like one shoe, right? It's just, I mean, and I think those are intentional metaphors because like a bike, like shoes, like things that get us from A to B, right? That's what computing is today. It's a means of transportation insofar as it takes us to new worlds, exposes us to, broad and deep sources of information that we didn't have just a few years ago, which is amazing. But we need to have both. So we really need to be thinking of, and in reality, we know from the digital advocacy, digital equity world that we talk about the three legs of the stool, internet and devices and skills. And we do need all three of those, absolutely. But we often think of the internet kind of as the kind of, we give primacy to it, when in reality, I think what these data show is that internet and computing access need to go hand in hand, and that those two pieces are really the first step together in order to build that literacy that we need to create, digital equity within our citizenry. Second, I think these data underscore the fact that as a society, we've really invested in the internet, but not public computing in the same way. And I think there's lots of reasons for that, which we described earlier, just given the kind of expense of laying fiber, et cetera. But I think the growth that we've had in public and home broadband over the past few decades is really phenomenal. It's not perfect. There's lots of areas where we know that we still need to do better, but we've really been investing in that in certain ways. I think the conversation there has really expanded after COVID. But it's not, we need to do the same with computing. We need to be having that same conversation about investment when it comes to computing. And, that could be kind of infrastructure at the national level, perhaps, or even state and local levels on lending programs, public tech support programs. But also subsidies for devices, I think, should be a real conversation, just like we've come to normalize our subsidies for smartphones through Lifeline. I think, although we did this temporarily with post-COVID emergency benefits, that conversation just kind of drifted away. And I think these data suggest we need to be rethinking those types of at-home subsidies as well.
And so you've spoken a little bit about this, and obviously all of the effort and the money that's gone into the broadband infrastructure. How might your research contribute to broadband adoption in an era where infrastructure is being deployed, but federal adoption funding's been cut?
Yeah. I mean, this is a great question because this is a moment of great uncertainty. And certainly, if I had answers here, people would be paying me a lot more money. But I think in reality, I was thinking about this question, and although I don't have any solution to, or even certainly can't make predictions about where policies should go or what funding will look like in just a few years. I do have two thoughts. One is I was talking to a scholar at a conference over the last weekend who has been doing policy work for decades. Sharon Strover, she's an excellent scholar, and in this space, and she was reminding me that policies always change, administrations always change. Yes, Right now, there might be more policy uncertainty than normal, but in reality, that there's always kind of an ebb and flow. And and then this is the piece that kind of I was mulling over is the reality is, I think that after COVID and after all of the funding that we had slotted for digital equity out of the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, even if we don't end up seeing all of that funding, I think the genie is out of the bottle, right? Now that we've already asked all of our states to create these broadband plans, yes, there's a lot of I'm sure, wringing of hands and pulling out of hair to have to revisit those plans. But what we do know is that people at every state are already thinking about these issues, and I don't think you can unthink them, right? You can't become unaware of just how important technology is today to do anything, right? We can't, I mean, we can't hardly get through a kind of basic life, regardless of your income or education level, without getting online multiple times a day just to get through the day. And so, given that context, I think that maybe what we need to be doing is continuing to invest at the state and municipal levels and get really creative about solutions because um, a lot of states and counties, rather, our county included. I just did a project here locally interviewing local nonprofits. And, you know, we don't have a county level office of technology that is public facing. We have an internal office, right, that does tech support for the county. But there's no office that's designated to figure out to make sure how do the citizens of Santa Barbara County get online. Now we have some really interesting and get access to devices, right? We have some really interesting local coalitions that have been built to think about this issue. But I personally think, from a policy perspective, that over the coming decades, what we need to start doing is thinking about kind of investing in infrastructure like county level infrastructure, civic infrastructure across organizations and partnerships. And this kind of thing, I think, is happening, this kind of building up of uh, kind of community coalitions that will stick around for the long term. Um, and so, I think the funding may kind of come and go, but if we can start thinking of solutions at the state and local levels for, again, I think when it comes to computing, things like lending programs or kind of low cost, highly visible tech support, literacy courses, things that are already there, but often fly under the radar. I think if we can kind of start building that infrastructure creatively with the resources we have and giving it visibility, that'll really serve us over the decades to come.
I love that. I appreciate and agree with that sort of hopeful vision that all of the work that and planning over the last few years that all of the states did is not for naught. Like many a plan for many things that governments support at the state and county and local level, it might be shelved at the moment, but certainly on people's minds, and with a huge number of stakeholders who participated in the planning process. I think much broader thinking has been done, obviously, about how to take sort of patchwork programs and expand them so that they can be more outreaching. So
Absolutely.
I
And
think you answered. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was simply going to say, I mean, to that point, I think that's a really good, I mean, I like your, I like your kind of optimism at my optimism. But I think that to that point, I think going back to those interviews I just did, actually, uh, and the idea that to some degree maybe some of these plans are going to get shelved. In our local coalition that's been built, and I'm just really impressed with what Santa Barbara has done here. Um, but I was looking through my data from these conversations that I had with various stakeholders, and what's really striking is Yes, libraries are in there. Yes, local nonprofits that primarily serve digital equity interests are in there. Locally here, there's an organization called Partners in Education, right, that distributes computers. These are great and important resources. But you know who's also in there because they now realize that they cannot serve their clients without digital infrastructure is public housing, local health clinics, local schools, and that's community colleges all the way down to, local elementary schools. I think increasingly, not only do state stakeholders hopefully have increased awareness as a function of the investment that had already started to roll out and these new broadband plans, but also, again, post-COVID, especially in healthcare. But I think that if you're serving the social sector and again, in any capacity, you know that you need to have an awareness of digital equity in your community today. And so, again, I don't know what the solutions are, but I think everyone realizes that the problem is real and that there's buy-in from kind of across many different sectors.
So I think you've answered this, but just are there any other important next steps for research in this area and that would lend themselves to what you'd want to see happen in policy and practice based on your findings?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think for me, the thing that I've been thinking about for, you know, um, even before this administration. So again, putting aside the peculiarity of this moment and just thinking about how do we make sure that we don't think about digital equity policy as one and done moments, right? How do we build infrastructure? I've been thinking about like how can we design policy for computing support, whether that's access to devices or tech support to keep people connected to the devices they use, or you know, kind of swapping programs, exchange programs. But how do we take models like we have models like Lifeline for smartphones, and I'm not saying we use that exact model, but this is not does not have to be a reinventing of the wheel. So whether that's again building community tech hubs or computer centers that are unique, or just kind of doubling down on investment that's there, I think part of the goal needs to be kind of focusing on the long term. And I think this community is already doing that, right? I'm not suggesting something new here, but I just thinking keeping our eye on the prize for 50 years from now, really, I think is, minimum is one important goal. And I think these data just tell us we have to get creative, right? There also needs to be more research in this area on those solutions. I think that data, people were really primed to do that data collection in the light of funding that we thought was coming. And so what that looks like, I don't know, but hopefully when and if funding still comes through, there's lots of evaluation, funding set aside for evaluation so we can figure out what are policy solutions that work across different municipalities and states. I think the three pieces more to get like a little more granular that I've seen in my data recently that I think need particularly more investment to do what I just described to kind of think of computing access for the long term, and maybe pieces that we're specifically not kind of doing enough in, although efforts always, nonprofit sector is always doing what they can with so little, but staff training, public outreach, and partnership building. I know that partnership building is something that's been happening in really amazing ways for a long time by folks like Digitunity or NDIA, but I think that that last piece, an investment in kind of creating coalitions that can then help affix digital equity infrastructure to our communities will then help us do the first two. But I do think that because technology changes so quickly and AI has really only accelerated that and shown a spotlight on that, a lot of times we can't help support our community members if we ourselves, the staff at these organizations, aren't sufficiently versed in what's happening. And so there's lots of catch up. So taking advantage of excellent work at the National Skills Coalition and really finding ways to systematize Um, Programs to train trainers, I think, is investment that really needs to happen so that we can have the human resources to support our community members. And I know the digital navigation system is one mechanism, but I think it shouldn't be the only one. And then honestly, I know that nonprofits don't want to set aside funding for messaging because you always want to feel like you're putting the dollars in to serve your clients. But I just think a lot of times services are going missed by the community members. And so investment in campaigns, marketing campaigns, public outreach, is actually going to be really critical because I think that's going to help these resources stick is when we see that they're getting utilized. And they're not going to get utilized if community members don't know that today the library is as much a community tech center as it is a place to get books. And some people know that, but a lot of people don't. Um, or, whatever other digital resources are in the community. If they're going missed, then we can't kind of fight for the dollars in the same way. So that was kind of a wandering answer, but I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it definitely does. And it's a great point about promoting and marketing the services. I think it's not only staffing capacity at a nonprofit or at government agencies like libraries, as you mentioned, it's sometimes an afterthought, not just the budget, but also the staff resources of someone with marketing communication skill set to be able to promote those things more broadly to the community and to folks who maybe don't have internet or a computer to begin with to get the email blasts that are going out about the services.
Right, absolutely. You have to get creative about how you reach the people you're not reaching, right? Because it can't just be using digital marketing or outreach. So, yeah, going to swap meets, going to the radio. But I think and this is just going to take time, but we just need to create norms around kind of community digital equity resources. So it's really an exciting moment to get to decide what those norms and what that infrastructure is going to look like. But yeah, making sure it's visible is kind of half the battle.
And then I think sort of the other side of that is I wonder what some of the most prominent research gaps are that you've maybe already identified related to computer ownership. Like what would you or should others look at next?
Mm. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, so I happen to be doing a study on kind of the psychological side of getting and staying connected because I was really struck in these interviews just how often staff that supports kind of local citizens getting online. And again, that's sometimes librarians, but sometimes it's, the local food bank staff person who also says, hey, let me help sign you up for, you know, regular information about food distribution sites, or, let me help show you how to get online to apply for a given government service agency. And they say their clients just kind of we have physical kind of reactions to technology when we're overwhelmed by it. So I've been really interested in kind of research on how to also train the trainers in ways that not only give them the skills they need to pass on, but also help them um, give them the kind of psychological skills to act like the kind of computer therapists that they kind of are, and have become. And I think many are already doing a great job, but I'm kind of interested in also scaling up that kind of uh, like psychological like solutions to help people feel more comfortable with computers. Because again, this stuff is not going anywhere. So I think as a society, many of us need to kind of reframe our relationship to technology so that it doesn't feel quite so scary. And again, that will also happen with time. But I think that's one place that we could perhaps use a little more research. There's actually been great research in this area, but I'd love to see kind of interventions tested and then scaled. Have those successes kind of shared broadly with the practitioner community so they can kind of get a sense of what are some best practices. Um, that's I know that sounds like I'm not talking about computer ownership, but in reality, I am because, again, so many of us have a computer today, but we don't have it tomorrow because when it breaks, if we're too afraid to go ask someone to help us fix it, then we're not, then we're just not going to get online again. And so for me, I think that there's just as much kind of urgency around not just research on how to get people their first computer, but how to keep people connected to those devices or how to get them, their second computer, their third computer, et cetera. Um, uh,
It speaks to me as a social worker, and I think this sort of social work mantra of meeting people where they are.
mm,
And the thinking of I'm sure you've seen this in your research, and it happens every day that a service provider at a food pantry or at the library or wherever is helping someone to register for some other service online. They need an email address. They don't have an email address. Now you're helping them set up an email address. How are they going to access that once they leave you to check the messages? Will they remember the password? It's a complex
yeah.
universe that, takes a lot of steps and handholding and learning to get comfortable with.
I think that's a really great point, Allison, in that. And I think that's what I'm getting at is like, I think a place for research to step in is to kind of aggregate those best practices that we know people are already doing, right? Like the things I'm talking about, people on the front lines are doing it day in and day out, but it's very diffuse and it is very community centric, which it should be. But how do we then, as researchers, try to like, you know, survey across these populations and learn again what are the best practices and then create practices in a way that then become normalized so that again they kind of become part and parcel of what public housing or food security offices do, right? How do they start embedding tech support or tech access, um, information and resources kind of for the future. And so because they're going to need to. And I think everybody knows that in some ways, but sometimes again, whether it's the clients themselves feeling a bit overwhelmed, but or just the staff. And so if you could imagine like a new system where it's like those emails get stored or I mean I think there's literacy solutions to help this population of kind of very low income tech users, very low literacy tech users stay connected that we just haven't learned yet. And that we're kind of exploring still. So
And one closing question, and you've shared some of this, but I wonder if there are other stories or moments in your research or past work that highlight the importance of computer ownership, that make it especially real or personal for you.
I mean, I honestly, I often go back to, I've kind of alluded to this, but one of the first conversations that I ever had uh, in work a decade ago, more now, when I started this work, because I started actually doing research on kind of the benefits of computing for social support. That was most of my research areas, and I was going into low income neighborhoods and just asking, would you be interested in kind of using these new community building apps that we were designing. And in these kind of preliminary interviews, people would say things like, "Oh yeah, I'd be happy to, but my computer's just so slow. I have a computer, but I just never get online." And this person who kind of who specifically made that point, again, without even thinking twice, yes, I have a computer, meaning if I was asked in a Pew survey or a census data about whether I have a computer, I'm going to show up as a yes. But in reality, it doesn't work very well. It's basically non-functional. I don't know how to use it, right? Those kinds of stories just happen again and again. Um, and so for me as a researcher, it meant, well, we have to collect different kinds of data, which we now have. I'm very excited that we don't just ask, do you own a computer, but we ask about the quality. Um, but the I mean, it's really hard to pinpoint like a specific outcome because in reality, we use computers for everything. So I can't say, I mean, we do know that we particularly like to when it comes to something like healthcare, we often prefer a large screen over a small screen. Um, but in reality, there's not too many things we couldn't do in both places. Most things I can do on the computer. Oh, there's my son. I can also do on my phone. It's just that often, again, um, it's the kind of depth of engagement, the lack of stress is lower when we're on a large screen. And I would go back to the skills again. I really think that we need to think about access as that first step towards skilling up um, people on what AI is or how to log on to your, you know, e-records, health records, and um, it's just hard to learn, get those skills on the small screen. I don't know if that answers that last question. It's kind of broad,
No,
but
no, it does. I always find those personal experiences so interesting. I think they're sort of required for people who haven't thought. You've obviously thought about this as deeply
yeah,
as anyone has, but people who sort of take it for granted that yeah, sure, I have a computer and I use it for these things, or a phone and I use it for these things, and sometimes my internet cuts out and that's frustrating, or something's not working and I have the wherewithal or the skills to call someone or determine that it's my modem or it's my router or it's the device or I need to
yeah,
update software, turn it off. All of those things are barriers to entry
yeah,
for a large portion of the population, and in particular, those who don't have a computer receive something that's, you know, a computer, but not a, not well operating, that doesn't have enough RAM or a large enough hard drive to meaningfully operate for them in a way that it's not just um, you know, a decorative piece in their apartment versus a
yeah,
tool that they use
exactly.
meaningfully.
And I mean, I appreciate your kind of question about stories. I think the reality is that, um, I mean, this was really illustrated for me years ago when we went and asked about unstable cell phone access, and I was interested in kind of health outcomes. And I thought people were going to say, you know, yes, I didn't get to the emergency room in time or things like that. But in reality, like, in those moments when kind of it is a life or death situation, we manage to find ways around the technology, right? And so sometimes the I think the lack of computer access in particular is kind of death by a thousand cuts, right? Because it's not that you just kind of go, ugh, this is annoying. And then you shove it aside and, go make dinner for your kids. And so, in reality, we know that it's not the first thing that people need, right? They need often gas in their car or money to pay rent. Um, and it feels like there's workarounds because you can sometimes borrow a computer or ask your kid for help, but it's the kind of, again, kind of slow degradation of life, and the slowing down of access to information, of access to resources that kind of just over time exacerbates these existing inequalities that were already there in a pre-digital world. Well, now if you have to have, a computer to get healthcare, then maybe you're just going to wait a few extra weeks to go see your doctor or to get those test results or to get your drugs from the pharmacy or to sign up for those social services. And so, sometimes the costs are great and obvious, but often because computing it's the mechanism for getting resources that it's easy to miss, right? And I think users themselves also don't see it, right? They don't say, well, I didn't get food stamps because I don't have my computer. Now, I have had clients say that. My phone was dead and I missed out on my food stamps. But those moments are few and far between. Again, it's really just this kind of slow um, degradation of again, resources that I think in the aggregate, though, is really consequential for even an individual, let alone society.
Amy, thank you so much. This was wonderful.